Hi, welcome everybody. My name is Nina Jane. I'm the Programming and Community Engagement Librarian at the Cary Library, and I'm really thrilled to be here and have this program with you. Before we get to it, I'm going to just a couple things. Wanted to say thank you to the Cary Library Foundation for supporting all of our adult programming. We could not do this without them, which means we could not do it without you. So thank you for any donations you make to the foundation. I guess there wasn't two things, it was just one. So I'm going to go right into an introduction of Rachel Kaprelian, who's helped me tremendously bring this program to Lexington. This is a history and discussion of the Electoral College. Rachel Kaprelian was appointed by President Barack Obama to the role of US HHS Regional Director for Region 1, which is New England, where she worked with public and private sector stakeholders on federal health care policy, including the Affordable Care Act's implementation, its policy innovation models, and active demonstration grants. Prior to that, she served in executive and legislative roles in Massachusetts as Secretary of Labor and Workforce, as Registrar of the Mass Registry of Motor Vehicles, and as a 6-term member of the Massachusetts House of Representatives, where she focused on healthcare policy and economic development. She began her political career a year after she graduated from college. She's always been engaged when she was elected City Councilor-at-Large in her hometown of Watertown. She currently lives in Lexington. We're really happy that she does. And when I first reached out to her about this program, I know Victoria's not here today, but Victoria Budson introduced me to Rachel, and Rachel immediately wanted to help with creating programs that would engage our minds around what was happening in the world around us. So I'm really, really pleased to have her here. And I am going to be out, and Rachel will introduce Andrew Rudalevige. Sorry, can you say your name?
Rudalevige. It's great to be here.
I should have asked you beforehand. And so welcome everybody, and I hope you enjoy the conversation. You can put tech issues and chat comments in the chat, and use the Q&A for questions, which Rachel will be monitoring.
Okay.
All yours, Rachel.
All right. Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us. Welcome to a history and discussion of the Electoral College, something that is very timely, happened just this week, in fact. So it started at the beginning of our country, and the last time we participated in it was this week. So I am so delighted to have with us today Andrew Rudalevige, Professor Andrew Rudalevige. He is a good friend of mine and someone who is no stranger to Massachusetts. He's a graduate of Watertown High School, and he worked in the state senate for a number of years, and was also a city councilor in our mutual hometown of Watertown. Nowadays, he is the Thomas Brackett Reed Professor and the chair of the Department of Government and Legal Studies at Bowdoin College in Brunswick, Maine. He's the past president of the President's and Executive Politics section of the American Political Science Association. He is an author, and his books include the forthcoming By Executive Order, Bureaucratic Management and the Limits of Presidential Power, Managing the President's Program, Presidential Leadership and Legislative Policy Formulation, which won the National Newstat Prize, which is a really big deal in political science circles. The New Imperial Presidency, Renewing Presidential Power After Watergate, the co-authored textbook, The Politics of the Presidency, and a series of edited volumes on the Bush and Obama presidencies. He writes frequently on executive power and national politics as a contributor to the Washington Post's Monkey Cage blog, and is the creator of, quote, Founding Principles, a series of videos on American government and civics available on the Bowdoin College website, and is a PBS learning media resource. His current research centers on presidential management of the executive branch, including institutional history of the Office of Management and Budget. And in a former life, as I mentioned, he was a city councilor elected by his district and a state senate staffer in the Massachusetts State Senate. He is a wonderful person and a terrific friend, and it is a pleasure to have you. Welcome, Andy, to Lexington remotely.
Thanks so much. It's great to be in the Commonwealth again, even by Zoom, waiting for the snow to come. So hope we can distract you all in the audience from the impending blizzard while we talk about, happy topics like popular democracy. That'll be a good thing.
It is, and yeah, it is an electoral college is one of those things that every 4 years we bring it back up again. It's only actually been of major political consequence in 5 elections when there has been a president that was elected president by the Electoral College who did not win the popular vote. One very recently, just 4 years ago. But it is an interesting historical lesson of what the Electoral College has meant in American politics, how it started. And of course, everybody's favorite question, why do we still have an Electoral College? Has it outrun its usefulness? How does it really matter, and will it continue to matter as it has in so many consequential elections? So let's begin with, my understanding is that it began sort of as a political compromise. That was one of like in the Tony Award winning show Hamilton, how the sausage gets made. I'll trade you this. How about that? Why don't we move this direction? And the Electoral College was one of those matters. So with that, how did it show up to begin with?
Yeah, well, like all good stories of American government, it starts in the Constitutional Convention. And you're right. We don't talk a lot about the Electoral College. I was looking at my favorite textbook on presidential elections, the very important Duck for President. And those of you familiar with that text may know that, of 101 million votes cast nationally, Duck winds up winning in a recount by exactly 10 votes. So we don't even teach our kids, right, that the Electoral College exists, right? Duck wins on the basis of the popular vote, and maybe it's wishful thinking on the case of the author, but the Electoral College doesn't tend to make for good children's literature, I think, in part because it is a sort of a weird thing to explain. And certainly those of you who have been abroad during a presidential election, trying to explain why it is that the person who wins the most votes nationally does not necessarily become president, becomes something of a burden very quickly. So yeah, it comes out of a set of problems that the framers of the Constitution have, Hamilton among them, trying to figure out how to elect a president, how to create an executive branch, frankly, because there had not been an executive branch of government at all in the Articles of Confederation government that preceded the Constitution, how to create an executive branch that was going to be safe, right? The worry was that whatever they created would turn into another George III, another monarch. And there was a lot of argument. Indeed, Elbridge Gerry of Massachusetts voted against the Constitution in part because he feared that the president that they had created would be too powerful. And part of that came down to presidential selection. You're trying to figure out how long the term should be, who should elect the president, and what powers that office should have. And every time they thought they had solved one piece of that, they realized they had undone a different piece. And the working compromise through much of the Constitutional Convention was to have a president who served for 7 years, was elected by Congress, and could not run for re-election. And that's kind of where it was. Only people didn't really love that either, because if you're going to have a separation of power system, then it doesn't make a lot of sense to have Congress choosing the president. And if the president can't run for re-election, wouldn't they wind up, enriching themselves, right? What would be their incentive to behave well if they couldn't run? And some people, just on a sort of a basis of political philosophy, thought, yeah, the people ought to be involved in choosing the presidency. And so, it wound up getting kicked around. It got put into a committee. Wound up, in fact, in the Committee on Postponed Matters, which is the real name of every committee ever created, I think. And they worked with it. They bounced around some ideas, and they came up with what was effectively, a compromise that later we've kind of given theoretical significance, and it's not inconsistent with other parts of the Constitution, for sure. But it basically solved a bunch of these problems, right? Because it basically turned it over to the states, who could then choose whether they wanted electors to be chosen by the people, by popular vote, by the state legislature, by some other mechanism. There's nothing in the Constitution that says you couldn't do it by lottery or Powerball ticket or whatever. Basically, the states were going to have a lot of autonomy. And so as you're selling this document to your states, and remember the states had to ratify the Constitution, you could point to the Electoral College and say, we are creating this body. It is representative of the states who are coming together. So we're maintaining some state autonomy, and you had to kind of suck up to the states in order to make sure that they were on board with this pretty big change to national governance. And they could say, if you don't like the idea of a popular election, and there were many people who didn't, who thought that the people broadly did not have enough information or education to make a good choice, then you didn't have to go with a popular vote. If you did like a popular vote, then you could.
Yeah, they were afraid of mob rule. They were afraid of just people who were not, could not possibly really judge these candidates. So they needed to kind of have a, another to help keep a check on them. Is that
well, George Mason, right, who you heard of from George Mason University, right? A lot of colleges named after people at the convention. He also did not vote for the final document in the end. He feared that the president, as created in the Constitution, would be the, quote, fetus of monarchy, and it would grow up to be a tyrant. But he actually said that he opposed a popular vote for president because, this is not an exact quote, but letting the people choose the president would be like letting a blind man choose my clothes. Right? It was about not even so much that people were stupid, right? It was more they just didn't have information. They didn't have information about, the country as a whole, right? You didn't have universal literacy, universal education. You didn't have, very wide spread or fast moving information, right? You had newspapers coming by stagecoach to an inn where, 25 people would read the newspaper, 2 other people who couldn't read at all. And so, the idea for somebody like Mason, sort of the aristocratic part of Virginia, that he would then put the, national leadership in the hands of, again, not stupid, but just ignorant in a descriptive sense, people, was really problematic for him. And there were others like James Wilson of Pennsylvania who said, you gotta be kidding, you don't have any legitimacy, unless you are chosen by the people. And so there is this sort of tension that's all across the Constitution between majority rule and then efforts to make sure that that majority rule doesn't turn into majority tyranny. Because as you say, there was this worry about mob rule. There weren't a lot of successful experiments with mass democracy in world history to that point. The framers were very familiar with what happened to some of the Greek city-states or to the Roman Republic and to the tendency, as they saw it, of democracy to devolve into mobocracy of some kind. And they were concerned. They thought the passions of the people could be problematic. And so, the idea of an electoral college in another sense is to have an indirect mechanism, right? This sort of independent body that on its own merits would be able to evaluate candidates, and it would be informed because it would know about the candidates at the national level, right? That's another issue. The country was so localized at that point that for someone to know, who a good leader from New Hampshire was, right? If they happened to live in North Carolina, it's just very unlikely. And so this is one reason, by the way, that electors can only vote for one person from their own state in the Electoral College, because they wanted to make sure that it wasn't just a very localized ceremony. So yeah, there was a nervousness about the people generally, and it's really, as we move through the sort of the different periods of American elections, obviously there's a small d democratization that takes place, but yeah, if you read Federal 68 and Alexander Hamilton's, arguments for why the Electoral College is so great, it is about this, independent body of electors who are going to use their expertise and educated merit to choose the best person, period, for the job.
Well, I have a quote from him where he said, qualified citizens, you need to have a number of qualified citizens to stop an unfit demagogue from being president.
Demagoguery was a worry. Yeah, absolutely. The idea that a silver-tongued someone could come in and sweep away the voters, was a reason for the Electoral College. And the worry that a a silver-tongued someone could come in and sweep away the members of the Electoral College themselves was also a worry, which is one reason, the main reason perhaps, that we have separate elections of the electors in their different states. So if you were watching C-SPAN or CNN on Monday, right, it kept bouncing to different state capitals. I watched the Boston ceremony, and the one in Maine, and one in Virginia, and one in Iowa, right? And, you know, it happened in those different state capitals so that you would not be able to corrupt all of them at once, because again, there was no way to communicate nationally or travel very fast.
Now they can just text each other in each state if they wanted
Sure.
to.
Well, now they're now they threaten each other on Twitter, but it's a different world. And you know, and then we should, you know, as we think about how it's evolved, right, that independent body of nonpartisan, even kind of supra-partisan, above the fray electors, that never developed, right? Certainly not after Washington's term, and maybe not even then.
Well, let's go to, there's been a couple of big moments in American history where there was a real move to abolish the Electoral College. Once in 1816, and another time more recently in our lifetime, 1969. Tell us briefly about, you know, what precipitated those two efforts and why did they not succeed?
Well, I'll focus on 1869 because 1969, sorry, because that's, you know, within more of our recent memory. And, you know, the issues that arise are largely the same over time. The idea that this is an undemocratic way of choosing the president, because after all, not everybody's vote counts exactly equally. And so we can circle back to that point and to some of the reform ideas. But in 1969, remember 1968 was a very eventful year, very, you know, comparable to 2020 in some ways, in terms of, you know, these sort of dire headlines rolling out day after day. And you had in the presidential race, George Wallace, right, as a third party candidate. So the former governor of Alabama, famous for his stance against desegregation, and ran kind of a, you know, I don't know if he used the phrase, but an America First campaign, right? You know, an idea that the two parties, led at that point by Richard Nixon and Hubert Humphrey. Humphrey had his own intra-party problems, but Nixon and Humphrey were basically the same thing in Wallace's view, and you know, Americans needed a change, by which he meant white Americans needed someone who would be tougher on civil rights issues. And he did attract, you know, a fair bit of support. He won a few electoral college votes. And, you know, the worry was, well, look, this is a pretty good real-time example of how the electoral college could wind up without a majority. And of course, if there's no majority in the Electoral College, then the House chooses the president based on state delegations, not based on the overall number of reps in the House, but based on each state delegation. So theoretically, you've got 50 states who have to then decide who they will support for president based on the top three finishers in the Electoral College. And that was actually, again, that was part of the original compromise. It was 5 people before the 12th Amendment, but the top 3, as it is now, you know, the idea was there was no nominating system, right? There were no parties. There were, you know, those arrived very quickly, partly because the Electoral College required coordination across all those state capitals on a single day. But, you know, when it was written, there were no parties. All the framers were, you know, explicitly against partisanship. All of them claimed they hated political parties 2 minutes before they founded one. There is a, you know, a sense that, you know, for those who were still happiest if Congress chose the president, the Electoral College, the fact that you might not have a majority, the fact that you might have, you know, a whole bunch of people being voted for by electors in different states, you know, could easily lead to, you know, no one getting a majority, and therefore, you know, the Electoral College effectively serving as a nominating body, you know, getting it down from, I don't know, 13 people down to 5. And then the House would get to choose.
Like a primary, like it would be like the Electoral College would almost serve like as a primary system, and then the House of Representatives. So, you know, the way you described it, So you have Congress now deciding like who's going to be president because you don't have an outcome of the Electoral College. So the Massachusetts delegation, all of our members of Congress would have to decide on who they're going to back. How does that work in a state with like complicated split delegation? And doesn't that just come down to, who's got the majority, much like the Electoral College is anyway? They
Right.
choose.
Well, you could certainly have a, yeah, I mean, this has happened rarely, right? And not since the 1820s, but it is it's certainly possible for, to have no majority. We came, again, Wallace was as close as we've come to that. Though, you probably saw some of the ways that you could fool around with the electoral vote tracker online and get a 269 tie, even in 2020, it wasn't completely impossible. But yeah, a third party, regionally strong candidate is the most likely way of doing that today. But again, yeah, there was no party system. There were no nominees of the party, no winnowing process. So you can imagine, in the 1800-ish world, right, with all, 20 Democratic nominees running around this in 2020, demanding electoral college votes. And, if it was split enough, then yeah, it would go into the House. Massachusetts, in present day would be a pretty easy case. They would vote for the Democrat who came up on top probably. But yeah, the other states would have to negotiate internally. Would they vote for this person for whom their state had voted? Would they vote purely on party lines? We don't know. But it's another reason why, some would like to get rid of the Electoral College, because again, you have this sort of possibility of shifting away from the popular vote altogether and moving to this entirely different mechanism. Again, at the beginning of the process back in the 18th century, this was a plus, right? The idea that you would narrow down all of these parochial sort of favorite son choices from the different states, and then Congress, who knew everybody and had more information, would be able to make the choice. So that was sort of sold as a plus at the time, but I think few people see it that way now.
So you were just describing what they call faithless electors?
Not exactly. So a faithless elector is someone who has pledged themselves to vote for a certain candidate in the Electoral College, but then does not.
Okay.
So,
How often does that happen, and how big a worry is that? Because obviously we had a president. We have a president who was trying to convince electors to do just that. So
yeah, there's actually probably a more organized effort in 2016. You may remember that fans of Hillary Clinton who were quite distraught after the election, were pushing what they called indeed the Hamilton Elector Project, right, to try to go back to an independent body. And their hypothesis was that no independent body that Hamilton would ever have chosen Donald Trump as president. And they might have had a point on that front. But you'll remember a few people, there were 2 voters in Washington state for Colin Powell, right? So he actually winds up he's in the record books, right, as somebody who has received electoral votes for president. I think there were 6 or 7 overall who wound up voting in a way different from their state. And that has been an issue as well over time, right? The worry, even though every state now requires electors to vote for the winner of the popular vote in that state, it was hard to know whether you could bind them to that legally. You could try, but it was hard to know whether you could punish them if they did not. There was a Supreme Court case only this year, actually, that came out of the Colin Powell votes in Washington state. And the Supreme Court said that it was constitutional for a state to pass a law punishing someone for being a faithless elector.
Like putting them in jail or fining them, or
Yeah,
just
yeah.
any kind of punishment? Wow. So there's more stake to being an elector. It isn't just a ceremonial job in some cases. If you go back.
Well, it's a ceremonial job unless you wish to violate the promises that you made to the people who chose you as an elector, right? And one reason that it's changed from its original model is that, at the beginning, again, you have this notion these are going to be independent people making their own decisions. That vanishes as soon as you have party nominees, because then the important part is to have electors who actually are not independent. There's a famous line from as early as I think 1800, somebody complaining about an elector saying, I voted for him for his vote, so that he would vote, not so he would think, right? And it's, so if a Biden elector this year, right, had changed and voted for somebody else, there would have obviously been a huge amount of attention on that person, a lot of pressure. They probably would have faced a fine or even jail time. In some states, they have a procedure where you're actually removed as an elector immediately upon your voting for the wrong person, quote unquote. And then an alternate elector is moved into that slot. So the Supreme Court has kind of blessed the idea that you can at least tie electors to the popular vote of the state a little more firmly than it was obvious you could do before. But that's not it doesn't mean you could not have faithless electors. And that, of course, is a worry too, right? The idea that, there's not an automatic translation of the state popular vote into that electoral count. There is this human process, again, that we saw actually happening in practice on Monday.
Well, I'm going to move to a question because it opens up another subject that has come up quite a bit in discussing the Electoral College this year, particularly. Was the Electoral College originally a compromise with slave states? And that moves into just the very matter of representation and race. So, many critics of the Electoral College say that it is not fair because, where there are, there's greater weight in states that have outsized influence, it's far less diverse and far less representative of what America looks like. Can you address first that question of, the compromise of the slave states, and then how it does or does not play into, racial injustice?
Yes. Can I just I forgot to answer the 1969 question.
Oh, yeah.
We got going on George Wallace. But the fact was, right, there was not there was a majority in the Electoral College in 1968. Richard Nixon won that election, but it sort of did prompt fears that the divisiveness of that time might reflect itself in the Electoral College and wind up causing. Wallace would have been one of the top three finishers, right? In theory, I mean, he would not have won the presidency in that context, but it was at least possible, and people were a little nervous about that. So the House actually did pass a constitutional amendment to get rid of the Electoral College and move to a direct national popular vote. The Senate voted for it, but not by the 2/3 required to move it through for state ratification. So it died there, but that was the closest we've come to actually changing that. So sorry, just wanted to.
But that is interesting because I've been paying attention to politics for a while, and it seems like there has been more clamoring that the Electoral College be abolished. Elizabeth Warren made it a central part of her race. That maybe where it's a subject that could be ripe again. Anyway, let's move on to the question of the state compromise. Was it or wasn't it? And then how all this time later in 2020, how it relates to racial justice.
Okay, so if we go back to the Constitutional Convention, the slave state question really gets roped into a lot of other discussion that's going on. Of course, notably the so-called Great Compromise, where you create the Senate and the House, and the House, of course, is driven by popular representation across the states. It's proportional to the size of the states. The Senate is an equalizing body representing the states as states, and therefore they are all equal within that body. And so that is how we move to a bicameral national legislature. Well, so added on to that, right, is the not so great compromise, actually the pretty cruddy compromise, right, which winds up, giving representation in the House on the basis of population while counting slaves as 3/5 of a person for the purpose of figuring out how much population there was to represent, right? And of course, the slave states said, oh, of course, you should count all slaves as people. And the northern states said, that's ridiculous. You don't treat them as people in any other way. And they came down with this 3/5 number. So once you've done that, right, and boosted your population, the slave states were very much interested in having legislative selection rather than a popular vote, right? Because a lot of their population that was represented in the House couldn't actually vote. And so they were much, they were actually small states population-wise, in part because, of course, they had, in some cases, a majority of their population enslaved. So you have now they find an ally in other small states, Rhode Island, for example. Rhode Island, by the way, is a pain in the tush all the way through this period. No offense to anybody in the audience who's a big fan of Little Rhodey, but they are Rogues Island, right? They are, there's lots in Delaware, right? Small states that are worried that if we have a direct popular vote, they will never have any influence again. Mm-hmm. And by the way, that's a worry they still have. But, the idea is if we are truly nationalizing this election, then how will somebody from Delaware ever win, right? The idea, Joe Biden might have asked that very question had he been present, right? The idea, and of course, this is, at a time when state identity is really important to people. Even James Madison called himself, right, a son of Virginia. He didn't think of himself as an American more broadly, necessarily. In many contexts, he thought of himself first and foremost as a Virginian. And so, you have, that kind of worry that you're going to have sort of very parochial voting patterns. So the New York, Virginia, Massachusetts are basically going, Pennsylvania are going to dominate national office. And so, in order to get stuff through the convention, you need to attract those small states to vote for your proposals. And so it's not so much that they're slave states, but they have already benefited, right, from the idea of a House and a Senate for that matter, but a House too that overrepresents them. And so something like the Electoral College, even if they're not going to get direct congressional election, then something like the Electoral College, which is based on the size of congressional representation, is the next best thing. And again, that's true for the slave states for sure, but it's also true for other small states. And so there are these coalitions that occur, again, not specifically on the basis of slavery, though that is at the bottom of that. There are arguments, by the way, right, that, the voting, that the Electoral College does actually benefit populations that vote in lockstep, right? And that could, in the 1940s, you would have seen arguments, about Harry Truman's election in 1948, for example, which was ascribed in some cases. You remember the Dewey beats Truman headlines, right? It was a very close election. Truman, was part of a Democratic Party that for the very first time actually had a civil rights plank in its platform. And Northern Blacks, who had often been Republican voters to that point, remember, this is the party of Lincoln. Why would they vote Democratic, which was the party of segregation in the South? They actually, in key urban areas, in key northern states, voted very heavily for Truman. And, we don't have good exit polling. This is a lot more, sort of after the fact envelope scribbling than real analysis, perhaps. But that was sort of the way it was seen, was that, in fact, that insular racial minorities, as they were called, could actually be helped by the Electoral College because they would be able to swing a close state, in a given direction if they were to vote together. Now, of course, that's not limited only to race or ethnicity, but it is it's one way in which, it is argued that any swing population of a swing state is going to be important in the Electoral College, right? And you're seeing that in a more negative sense. Of course, the accusations, by the president that all these votes are illegitimate coming out of Philadelphia or Milwaukee or Detroit. That obviously has, many dimensions to it, but it's an interesting a twist on that Truman story.
Well, the 1948 story you referenced, there was quotes from Democrats in the South who actually made comments pretty straightforwardly that, why should Black Americans in the North outside our votes in the South, and it was directly said.
Well, and remember in 1948, the Dixiecrat Party walks out.
Thurmond, yes, exactly.
Strom, Strom was a jerk for 80 years in American politics. Anyway, go
Not
ahead.
sure if he was present in the end there. There was we're not entirely sure what happened in those last few years. Before I get to the questions, which are imminent, I want to, we talked about swing states, and that's, we all say the same thing. Like, we're in Massachusetts, we love to get up, we love to go vote, but we know it doesn't really matter what we do in Massachusetts, because we know what's going to happen with our democratically led state. There was almost no chance it was going to go in a different direction. So we look at the same handful of states, and the states, they flip, here and there. Sometimes a swing state is Arizona, sometimes it's not, sometimes it's New Hampshire, sometimes it's not. Just to speak briefly as to sort of, swing states in an electoral college, and, what to do about that. I mean, this is a big country, there are a lot of, big interests. Why should it be that there's really only a handful of states that matter?
Well, I mean, I suppose the easy answer to that is that you pointed it out already. You don't have to be a swing state. There's no rule that says Massachusetts must vote for the Democratic nominee. Massachusetts voted for Ronald Reagan, I think twice, right? This is not it's not a law handed down by some kind of electoral heaven that any given state will be uncompetitive in a given year. If you look back at the textbooks, probably Watertown High in the 1980s, right? It probably said that California was Republican forever, right? And indeed, if you look through the 1988 election anyway, there was a talk in political science about this Republican L, which was the entire West Coast and all the way across sort of the northern tier of the country until you hit the Great Lakes. And you were going to, have it's just a Republican lock on the Electoral College, right? And now, of course, with California having, gone very solidly Democratic since 1992, even more since 1994 and 6, when Republicans in that state began to adopt more anti-immigration policies, right? There are choices in these states that make a difference for how they vote. You have a very different story, right? Where Democrats sort of start with those 55 electoral votes in the bag, as it were. And that's I do think there is something to be said for, campaigns trying to make states more competitive through the policies that they take and the coalitions that they try to build. And, over time you see shifts. I mean, Texas, right, has been in recent years a very Republican state. It used to be a very Democratic state. With demographic change, it may become, it's already kind of a purple state. So you begin to see, Virginia, right, which has become heavily Democratic after being Republican. And of course, even before that, being part of the solid South and Democratic again. So I don't know that there's any lock on this. It does shift. It is true, of course, that the Electoral College, being state by state matters a lot about winning a state. And if a state is close, then that is the state you're going to look to and put your resources into.
Yeah. Well, this is
I suppose the counter argument, right, is that, you could have a geographically concentrated majority that, sort of was imposing its will on the rest of the country. The big question, in a way, and this is a philosophical question that I suspect we can't answer, is, do states matter at all, in the United States anymore? What do they matter for? Should they get representation? Because if we want to be sort of chauvinistic about it, I can sit here in Maine and say, well, in 2016, the entire margin of victory in the popular vote for Hillary Clinton was out of California. And I don't want California. Trump won. If you take 49 states in the District of Columbia, Trump won the popular vote, but he got crushed in California. And I don't want California telling me how to run my life, blah, 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 right?
Right.
I don't know. I mean, on the other hand, right, I can certainly make the argument that, people in California really are people, including my family members who live there. If they're here in the audience listening, I love you, right? You count. But there is, this is a question we have to grapple with, I think, how we deal with the fact that the Electoral College is not democratic in a small d kind of way, right? Not every vote is equal, for sure. And yet it is, Republican in a small r kind of way.
Well, let's get to the questions. We've certainly talked a lot about, sort of how it works, how it, and we can also go into gerrymandering and how congressional districts are not really handed down in fair and equitable ways, which does affect, sort of what happens in all of
Well,
our.
can I just actually pick up right there for a second?
Yep.
Which is just to say that, yeah, I mean, one thing we have seen, I talked about states being, it's possible to change their partisan hue, and that's true. But we have seen sort of what one author called the big sort, right? Geographic sorting, where people begin to move to places where they find it more ideologically compatible. And so states arguably become less competitive, harder to make competitive, no matter what a campaign might do. And congressional districts, of course, have been gerrymandered for years, but increasingly effectively in recent cycles. And so sometimes people say, well, we should elect the members of the Electoral College by congressional district. And of course, Maine and Nebraska do that. I think it doesn't bother me much in Maine because there's only 2 districts up here, and it's kind of hard to gerrymander a state with only 1.5 million people in it. But, if you have a big state where you can actually carve the districts up in a way that would really benefit one party, even if they, arguably lost the popular vote in the state, I think that would be problematic. And then you'd be treating people unequally inside a state instead of across states, which strikes me as even worse.
Yeah, well, that's a
Sorry.
that's a whole other webinar, but
Yeah.
it's a very important topic. So I'm going to go to the questions. Short of a constitutional amendment abolishing the Electoral College, what are some reforms that would pass constitutional muster that could ensure that the president is always chosen by the popular vote?
Well, the big one is something called the National Popular Vote Compact. And so it's an effort to tie by statute, by state statute, the electoral vote to the winner of the national popular vote, no matter how the individual state actually chose. So, and I think Massachusetts has signed on to this. And the argument then is that if in 2020, Donald Trump had won the national popular vote, then Massachusetts electors would have to vote for him, even though, Massachusetts voted, 60-40 for Biden, right? That's what the Popular Vote Compact would do. And the argument is that this would mean that there was never any variance between the popular vote and the Electoral College. And that's appealing, right? It does have, its issues because, again, it's it's done by state law, and states could change their law. And it runs potentially into that problem of faithless electors, right? Maybe less so now that the Supreme Court has ruled about the state's ability to punish faithless electors. But, you could see in a close election, right, people in a state that had not voted for a particular candidate, being very reluctant to cast their vote for the winner of the national popular vote. And so, this is has been so far taken up mostly in Democratic leaning states. Not too surprisingly, all of these things wind up being viewed through the prism of, will this help my party? And of course, Democrats have won the national popular vote for the presidency, I think every year except one since 1992. Am I getting that right? It's something like that. 7 out of 8 elections, I think.
Yeah.
And so, 2000 and 2016, of course, you had the misfire, quote unquote, in the Electoral College. So that's the most plausible way of tying the two things together, but it does have these political hindrances. It's hard to see enough states signing on to it to bring it about, but it's not impossible. And it would be short of a constitutional election, for sure, of an amendment, sorry. For sure, a constitutional amendment is the cleanest way to do this. Yeah. I would note even that has some issues, right? Because what if you had a constitutional amendment, winner of the popular vote, plurality vote, right? 20 people run, winner gets 8%, they would be legally elected under that particular amendment, but it's hard to know whether, that winner would have any more legitimacy than somebody who had won the Electoral College, even while losing the national popular vote. So you have to just sort of think of these unintended consequences. Do you have a runoff election? Do you have, ranked choice voting? Do you have to have some kind of mechanism, I think, for making it a two-stage process. It gets messy pretty quickly, right? So
another webinar topic.
That's
also come up more recently in Massachusetts, and you're doing it in Maine.
Maine ahead of everything. As Maine goes the nation.
Yeah, apparently, but like it is a lot easier, to your earlier point, to when you have 1.5 million people, it's a lot easier to kind of find experiments. So moving on to another question. So we have all these electors, they show up, nobody knows who they are. How are they chosen? And what's the basis for the number of electors in each state?
Okay, second part's easy. That's just the number of members of the House and members of the Senate for that state. So okay. Again, for Maine, it's easy. We have, 2 House members and 2 senators, so we get 4, right? And
4. In a car.
Yeah. Well, they could have done their electoral college vote in a minivan, I think, and even spaced enough to make that safe these days. Yeah, but in bigger states, obviously, it's many more. So again, take the House delegation, add the 2 senators, and that is your electoral college count for the state. So they are just, in some states, you actually have on the ballot that you are voting for the electors of Donald Trump, Joe Biden, whoever else. Some states you used to actually vote for the electors by name, which was problematic in the sense that nobody knew who they were. You're absolutely right. In most states now, it's a little bit of electoral sleight of hand in that you are voting for the candidate, right? And then their electors are selected as a result of the popular vote winner. And those electors are chosen usually by the parties in each state. So the party organization, whether it's a state committee or however they've set it up, they are in consultation with the campaigns themselves, right? Mm-hmm. You're looking for people, to be honest, who are not independent thinkers. Independent thinking is a bad idea, right? Because that leads to faithless electors. You didn't want anybody.
Guilty.
Yeah, there you go. You didn't want anybody who could possibly be tempted, right, to change their vote. And so, yeah, I mean, if you went, again, through the C-SPAN, roster of states doing this, as you went from a Trump state to a Biden state, you saw effectively the same kind of speeches, about, how great their party was and how great their candidate was. The Trump ones had a little less triumphalism about them. Well, not all of them, but the realistic Trump ones had less triumphalism about them. And so they're chosen effectively handpicked. I think there may be an electoral process within the state committee party, but I think it's really, an application process effectively, and the most loyal person wins. Sometimes they are chosen on relatively symbolic grounds. Well, you want kind of the Democratic Party clearly, as I was looking at on Monday, wanted a diverse set of electors to show up, right? Age, gender, race, right? They wanted, sexual orientation, right? There were a lot of people, sort of there to represent the party in its broadest tent kind of sense. And so, there's, I think, some of that as well. Normally, these aren't particularly well watched, by the public. It's a kind of a clerical process in a lot of ways, but there is some ceremony to it, right? It is you get a certificate saying you were an elector. There's.
Yep, I saw some of my Facebook friends who were electors posing with that. So it is exciting. It's an important function. So there's a question of, were there instances in our earlier history where a state's electors were chosen without the occurrence of a popular vote in that state? And if so, how were those electors chosen?
Yes. So there's a couple of examples. I mean, the normal way that states chose their electors without a popular vote was by vote of the state legislature, right? And they actually would choose. So, and in fact, so up to 1824, really only about half the states had a popular election for president. And so when you look at 1824, for example, as a misfire, right? Because it's true that Andrew Jackson got the most popular votes. And of course, John Quincy Adams wound up being president. But, it's a misfire, sort of. It kind of comes with an asterisk because many of the states did not actually hold an election for president. So Jackson might have gotten the most popular votes if all the states had actually done it that way, but we don't really know that. So, that was the normal process. They haven't really experimented with other kinds of ways of doing things. Again, this became sucked into the national party process very fast. And the parties, right, were created in part at a national level. They already existed in Congress, right? You began to see, didn't necessarily have a name at the very beginning. Then they become the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans, sort of centered around Jefferson and Madison, around Hamilton and Washington. The coordination problem for the parties is that they want to make sure that they get a majority in the Electoral College. They don't like the House. That's going to be uncertain.
Mhm.
And so how do you get all these people across the country to vote for the same person on the same day? Well, then you have to have a political party that helps organize that.
Yeah.
And so once you have that, and that's early, right? Really 1796, then you really don't have many other mechanisms. As I say, it would be constitutional for a state to go with the Powerball route. Whoever raises the most money for charity gets to be an elector or whatever. But that's, has not been a method that's been adopted.
Electoral Powerball. When you referenced earlier the Maine and Nebraska that have the proportional electoral votes, would you say that a system of proportional electoral votes would go a long way to addressing the deficiencies of the winner-take-all electoral college?
Yeah, I would not. I hinted at this earlier, I think. And I wouldn't, because it's not really proportional. It's by congressional district. And congressional districts are made by people, and they're made by people for a particular purpose, which is to elect a particular party to Congress on the whole. And so again, where you have states that have, creative legislatures who are able to redistrict down to the block level, right? When Rachel and I were working in the legislature, I think it was the 1990 redistricting or something. And they're working off, physical maps and, lists and census tracts, right? Now they have, house by house computer software, right? That will give you a sense of how you can draw these districts most efficiently. And, to the degree you're doing that, then again, creating congressional districts as little mini states within your state with their own electoral vote, I think becomes problematic. There is an appeal to it, right? Because it does mean that people within a state who feel differently than the majority get a little bit of representation. And I do understand that. That's certainly, been the case in Maine, where the northern part of Maine is more conservative, certainly, than the southern half of the state. But again, I think if you were to extend that nationally, you would wind up with even more efforts to gerrymander congressional districts than you have now, because it would mean something, right? You get another prize for that at the end. There have been discussion about sort of a mathematical model, right? Effectively, dividing up the Electoral College, and states could do this. Maybe this is an addendum to the question about the National Popular Vote Compact. States could say, right, if Joe Biden gets 60% of the vote in my state, he gets 60% of the Electoral College votes. And you could divvy it up just like that, right? You could, decide that instead of doing it by congressional district, you do it by some percentage of the vote, maybe even by tenths of an electoral vote. Who knows? I mean, there's nothing really to prevent that. Again, what that probably means is both good and bad, right? It means that third parties would have something to run for, because they would have a chance to get an electoral vote or a part of a vote if they were to win enough votes, even though not a majority in a state. So think about Ross Perot, for example, right? Who won, close to 20% of the vote nationally in 1992 and got 0 electoral votes, right? That in one way seems unfair. However, it would probably push elections back into the House much more often, because you would have a tougher time accumulating a majority of electoral votes if you were splitting those votes proportionally. It's kind of like the, in the primaries where you have, Republicans tend to have sort of a winner take all system for delegates in a state. Democrats tend to have proportional voting. It's going to take longer to get to a majority if you have proportional voting. And if you wind up in the House more frequently, I'm not sure you've achieved the purpose of reforming the Electoral College. So again, that's something you could do, but again, there are unintended consequences potentially.
Was there ever a presidential contest decided by the House of Representatives?
There have been a couple. Yeah, so in 1824, as I mentioned, this is a case where basically the nominating system broke down a little bit, and you had 3 or 4 major candidates kind of stayed in the race. They did not take the hint from their co-partisans that they were supposed to drop out. And so you had, Henry Clay, who's a big figure in American politics, a guy named William Crawford, who these days is not, but he was the Secretary of War at the time. Andrew Jackson, John Quincy Adams, right? And they are battling it out, and they split the electoral vote. And so the ultimate result there is that Henry Clay cuts a deal with John Quincy Adams and basically throws his support to Adams, who winds up winning in the House. Jackson, of course, goes on to lose, but to rant for the next 4 years about how he's been robbed. There is a lot of sore loserdom in American history, and sometimes it's more productive than at other times. Jackson actually, through his sort of reaction against the House vote, winds up helping to create the mass party system, right? And making sure, through his lobbying and through his allies, that all states move to a popular vote system for the Electoral College over time. So yeah, you have 1824, 1800. Before that, this is the tie vote, the famous that does show up in the musical Hamilton, between Jefferson and Aaron Burr. That's before presidents and vice presidents were elected separately. And that, of course, winds up coming down to whether the outgoing House of Representatives, which is a Federalist majority, can stomach voting for either of these people. And Hamilton ultimately, helps Jefferson win that election. It hasn't happened since, though. We should give a shout out, I guess, to 1876, which was a nightmare of an election, where, and this has been sort of studied up for this year, because more than one set of electors was sent from a number of states to the House, to Congress. So depending on which electors Congress accepted, you could have had a situation where either candidate won, or even a situation where there was a tie in the Electoral College, because there was one elector out in Oregon who was under dispute. So that wound up being settled through an electoral commission that was created, and the Electoral Commission wound up having a majority of Republicans on it, 8-7. And coincidentally, by an 8-7 vote, they awarded every single disputed electoral vote to Rutherford B. Hayes, who won the presidency by 1 electoral vote as a result. I guess the downside of that, well, there were many downsides of that election. That would be yet another webinar, perhaps. But the upshot, the deal that was cut, right, so that Democrats did not start a second civil war over that result, was that the incoming administration, along with the outgoing Grant administration, agreed to withdraw Union troops from the South, right, effectively ending Reconstruction and jumpstarting Jim Crow and another century of suppression of African Americans in the South. So it's not an entirely happy story. And it's one, it actually, interestingly, caused the creation of what's called the Electoral Count Act in the 1880s, which is what we still have today, right? So if there is a dispute come January 6th in Congress, it will be governed by the Electoral Count Act, which was passed after the mess of 1876. The good news, sorry, go ahead.
Again, since it was passed in 1876, has it been sort of shelved, and is there if it needs to be brought out again?
Yeah, we haven't had, the good news, I guess, is we haven't had massively contested elections in quite the same way. 2000, obviously, we could talk a little bit about that. That's probably within the living memory of most of our listeners here. But on the whole, the Electoral College whatever we say about it, does create a clear winner in most cases, which is a plus. I mean, even translating relatively narrow majorities into seeming landslides. President Reagan in 1980, got less than 51% of the popular vote nationally, right? Less than Joe Biden just got, right? And yet he won 40 plus states. And therefore, if you look at the map of 1980, right, it's a landslide and people treated it that way. So it's an interesting tool of sort of constructing mandates and so forth. But yeah, the Electoral Count Act has luckily not had to been used very often, which is good because it's not a very good piece of legislation, really. It's not very clear about some things.
Well, you took away what I was going to say, which was like, well, there's an American answer, through our history, through almost everything, but, not when it's not a good thing to pull back off the shelf. And it's another lesson that like, these are still, fallible humans who are kind of coming up with what to do next and, how to address some of these problems. And they are often a window to the times, when things have become so divided, and we're living in divided times now for some of the same reasons that you discussed historically. The last question that came to this is, and this is sort of like what I hear about redistricting. And I was part of a redistricting when I was in the legislature, and it really is one hell of a process, and it is impossible to extricate it from the political. It's just not possible when you have human beings who are protecting what they know, and that it doesn't become a political process with that many people. And it had come up when I was in the legislature, like, why don't we have a computer program that spits out fair districts? Why do we need human electors? Why can't we just spit out, kind of what, fits, what the model should be?
Yeah, well, in the latter point, I mean, we would need a constitutional amendment because the Constitution specifies the role of individual electors and what they're supposed to do. But there isn't, there's no philosophical reason that if we are committed to the winner of the popular vote winning the Electoral College votes from that state without any human intervention, there's no reason you could not make that translation automatic, right? You could do that. Redistricting is a little bit harder, right? Because you've got, different political interests vying for a certain amount of geography. And, there are states that turn this over to an independent redistricting commission, right? Which is not exactly a computer, but which, is charged with achieving the best result they can on a number of bases. But you still have to decide, and this is a political question, what do you want to prioritize? Is it the size of the district? Is it the continuity of the district, right? Is it all connected? Is it compact? Does it protect existing borders like towns and cities, counties even? Because all of those things, if you tell it to do something different, could lead to quite different looking maps. Do you want the elections to be competitive? Right? Because I challenge you to make a competitive map in Manhattan, right, where a Republican could win in Congress without drawing something that goes, from Manhattan to practically Buffalo, right? So, that would violate our compact principle. It would violate our existing political communities principle, but it would create a competitive election, which arguably is what we're after here. So, there are these challenges involved, especially, we talked briefly about geographic sorting, and I think that is a real issue. There have been jokes, and maybe not entirely jokes, about resettlement programs for Democrats, right? Because they're poorly distributed for a geographic system of representation. Right? They're winning elections by way too much in certain places, right? And they need to go out and populate places where Republicans are winning elections with smaller populations, because again, we have the Electoral College does reflect this idea that you have that states matter, geography matters, and we haven't sort of adjusted to a world in which maybe we do have fewer borders and freedom of mobility and communication in a way that the framers could not have envisioned.
Yeah. I mean, some of it too is like, people don't stay in the same place. Like look at Arizona, that is now, Democratic. People are saying that's because of the exodus from California that just turned that over in just a few years. So we are just about at time. We're a little past, we were supposed to go to, we thought it was 8:15. We ran through all the questions. I think that we can probably do a wrap up now, Andy, Professor Rudalevige. As I said earlier, for those of you who weren't in the beginning, Andy and I are friends from way back, so it isn't often that I have him as the professor. So at the end of the day, I asked you this before we had this panel discussion. Electoral College, yes or no?
It's interesting because I can't answer it. All right. So as I tell my students, there is no interesting question in political science that's a yes or no question. It's always, it depends, right? And your job is to say, what does it depend on? What are the conditions under which something is more likely to be true? Here, though, I mean, if you were to come to a vote, in 2000, I would have said, yes, keep the Electoral College, right? That was the first misfire in a long time in terms of its relationship to the popular vote. It wasn't by a lot of votes, really, nationally. It was a weird situation. You're not likely to have an election where the entire thing comes down to one state that has wacky paper ballots and, it's 500 votes, right? I mean, Florida in 2000 was just a very different situation, actually, than we had in anywhere in 2020. And so, my feeling then was, right, that the risks outweighed the rewards of change, right? That we didn't have any kind of consensus around a different system that would work better. We didn't have any consensus around a popular vote system that would not fracture the vote more than the Electoral College system does. That there is some value and stability to a two-party system. It's stultifying in one sense, it's stable in another, right? And you get to choose which you think is more important. And the two parties have shown an ability to adapt over time, right? The Democratic Party of today looks a lot different than the 1920s Democratic Party or the 1950s Democratic Party, for that matter, and the Republican Party likewise. So there is my worry, and I think the reason I might vote no on the Electoral College now, is that I think we are in an increasing period of polarization where the gap between the Electoral College and the popular vote may widen in many elections. We could have seen it here. The margins were bigger in 2020, and of course the popular vote margin was much bigger too. And that kind of misfire, I think, would raise some real problems for legitimacy of the incoming president who won under that system. We don't have a system now. I think the framers expected that the House really would be the national institution. It was the people's house. It was the only part of the federal government actually elected directly by the people at that time. And they thought that would be the real spur to popular representation of the nation as a whole. And now, we can kind of see that's not happening, right? Again, through polarization, gerrymandering, it's very difficult to see the House as a nationally representative body in some ways, which is unfortunate perhaps, but real. And so the presidency, which has evolved as the only office that represents the whole country, maybe ought to be elected by the whole country.
Well, that's a great synopsis on your thoughts on Electoral College. Thank you for your research. Thank you for your scholarship. Thank you for the books that you've written on the subject. And thank you for joining us here at Cary Library. Great to have you back in Massachusetts, even virtually.
Thanks. I hope to be there in person sometime sooner rather than later. It's been a long year.
Oh, yes, indeed. Mina, did you want to have some closing words? Or I see you came back up on my screen.
Yeah, I just wanted to say thank you to both of you for such an enlightening evening. I knew when I asked you, Rachel, that we would have an amazing conversation, but I can't tell you how much I've learned, and I feel like our attendees have as well. So thank you for a thorough conversation about the Electoral College. And yes, we could have several more webinars on all the different topics that came up today. But thank you, Andy, for your time. Rachel, thank you so much for your willingness to moderate and bring in your very well. I was just like, wow, he knows the dates. And I'm totally going to use the Rhode Island Tushy comment at some point.
I'll be nice to Rhode Island.
Okay. All right, but I am going to use it. So again, thank you so much, both of you, for your time and your thoughts, and for everybody who attended. This is really special.
Thanks, Mina. Good
Thank
night,
you.
everyone. Thank
Good
you.
night, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.